A new chief's test begins. The crisp morning air carried the faint scent of pine and dew as Samuel Bryant pulled his old sedan into the parking lot of the Maplewood Police Department. The car was nothing special, just a beat-up relic from his younger days that told no tales of its owner's achievements. He stepped out slowly, his polished black shoes crunching on the gravel. Dressed in a simple gray hoodie and jeans, his towering frame still managed to exude an aura of quiet authority. Samuel had recently been appointed as the new police chief of Maplewood, a position he accepted with a mixture of pride and trepidation. The department had a reputation, and not a good one. Accusations of corruption, racism, and unprofessional behavior had plagued it for years. Samuel, a seasoned officer with an impeccable record, was brought in to clean house, but he knew that wouldn't be easy. Maplewood wasn't just a department in need of reform. It was a place entrenched in its ways, and many within its ranks were resistant to change. He didn't come dressed in his uniform for his first day. Instead, he decided to step in unannounced, blending in as just another face on the street. He wanted to observe his new precinct through an unfiltered lens, to see the officers' true colors before the weight of his title altered their behavior. This wasn't his first rodeo, and Samuel knew that the best way to gauge a department's culture was to see it when no one was putting on a show. The parking lot bustled with activity. Officers in blue uniforms strode purposefully to and from their vehicles, a few exchanging jokes or quick greetings. Samuel took his time, watching. There was a camaraderie here, but something felt off. It was subtle, but he could see the small cliques and hear the undertones of exclusion in their laughter. He adjusted his hood and walked toward the building. No one paid him much attention as he passed through the double doors into the precinct. Inside, the atmosphere was lively but chaotic. Phones rang incessantly, officers darted from one desk to another, and the clatter of keyboards filled the air. The scent of cheap coffee and stale donuts lingered, a hallmark of every police station he'd ever been in. As he made his way down the hall, a group of officers gathered near a bulletin board caught his eye. They were laughing loudly, their conversation animated. Samuel approached quietly, just close enough to catch snippets of their banter. "Did you see that guy last night?" Thought he could mouth off and walk away, one officer said, grinning. Another laughed. "Yeah, Daniels put him in his place." Classic. The name Daniels stuck with Samuel. He'd read the personnel files before taking the job. Officer Mark Daniels was known for his aggressive approach and had racked up a troubling number of complaints. Most were dismissed without consequence, but Samuel knew better than to trust the thin veneer of a spotless official record. He continued down the hall, his eyes scanning the precinct's layout. As he reached the break room, a voice called out sharply behind him. "Hey, you lost or something?" Samuel turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered officer approaching him. The man's badge read Daniels. His tone was laced with mockery, and the grin on his face carried no warmth. "No, just looking around," Samuel replied evenly. Daniels didn't seem satisfied with the answer. He stepped closer, his expression hardening. "This isn't a public hangout, buddy. You can't just wander in here." Samuel remained calm. "I'm not causing any trouble, just observing." Daniels' grin widened, but there was no humor in it. "Observing? What are you, some kind of journalist? We don't need your type sniffing around here. Get lost." Before Samuel could respond, another officer nearby chuckled. "Yeah, Daniels, maybe he's just lost. Give the guy a map." The group erupted in laughter, and Samuel felt the heat rising in his chest. He'd dealt with men like Daniels before, officers who mistook their badge for a license to intimidate and degrade. But Samuel didn't flinch. He held Daniels' gaze, his own expression unreadable. Daniels leaned in, his face inches from Samuel's. "You deaf or something?" I said, "Get out." Then, without warning, Daniels spit directly at him. The room fell silent. The officers who had been laughing moments ago now looked on with a mixture of shock and amusement. Samuel stood still, the warm saliva sliding down his cheek. Slowly, he pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his face. His movements were deliberate, controlled. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through those doors?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Daniel sneered. "Just the ones who don't belong." The laughter resumed, but this time it was uneasy. Samuel didn't say another word. He turned and walked away, leaving Daniels and his group behind. The precinct intercom crackled to life. All personnel to the briefing room. Mandatory attendance. Samuel allowed himself a small smile. The moment he had been waiting for was here. The briefing room was packed with officers by the time Samuel arrived. Conversations buzzed as officers speculated about the meeting. Samuel entered through a side door, carrying a folder with the precinct's emblem embossed on its cover. He stayed out of sight, observing the room. Daniel stood near the back, arms crossed, his smug expression firmly in place. The officer was clearly enjoying his morning. At the front of the room, Captain Judith Harper, a seasoned officer nearing retirement, called for attention. "All right, settle down, everyone. We've got an important introduction to make." The room quieted, the chatter fading to murmurs. Harper cleared her throat. "As you all know, Chief Walters retired last month, and we've been awaiting his replacement. Today, I'm pleased to introduce you to your new chief." Samuel stepped forward, his footsteps echoing in the now silent room. The moment his face came into full view, the mood shifted, conversations halted, laughter died, and a palpable tension filled the air. Daniel's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of dawning horror. Samuel walked to the podium, placed the folder down, and scanned the room. His gaze lingered on Daniel's for a moment before moving on. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but commanding. "Good morning. My name is Samuel Bryant, and as of today, I am your new chief of police." The silence was deafening. Samuel let the weight of his words settle before continuing. "This morning, I walked into this precinct unannounced. I wanted to see things as they truly are, not through the polished lens of formal introductions." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room again. What I witnessed was deeply troubling. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Samuel silenced it with a raised hand. "Respect is not optional in this department. It is the foundation of our work. Without it, we fail, not just each other, but the community we serve." His voice sharpened as he turned his attention to Daniels. "Officer Daniels, your behavior this morning was unacceptable, not just as an officer, but as a human being. When you disrespected me, you disrespected the badge, this department, and the community we are sworn to protect." Daniels shifted uncomfortably, his face a mix of embarrassment and anger. Samuel continued, his tone unyielding. "Effective immediately, you are suspended pending an internal investigation." Gasps filled the room. Officers exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of Samuel's authority settling over them like a storm cloud. "This isn't about punishment," Samuel said firmly. "It's about accountability. The culture of bullying, disrespect, and prejudice ends today." The room was silent as Samuel stepped back from the podium. He locked eyes with each officer, his message clear. Change was coming to Maplewood, whether they liked it or not. The weight of change. The precinct was still reeling from the revelation. Officer Daniels' suspension was a bold move, a declaration that Samuel Bryant meant business. As the officers filed out of the briefing room in tense silence, Samuel lingered behind, standing tall at the podium. He didn't miss the sideways glances and hushed whispers exchanged between some of the staff. The weight of their unspoken thoughts pressed against him, but he remained unfazed. This was just the beginning. Captain Judith Harper approached him as the room emptied. She was a woman of experience, her silver hair neatly tied back, and her sharp eyes betraying a mixture of respect and wariness. "Well, Chief Bryant," she said, her voice low, "you've certainly made an impression." Samuel glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. That was the idea. It's time to shake things up. Harper hesitated before speaking again. "Daniels isn't just some rogue officer. He's been here for nearly a decade. He has friends, connections. Taking him down won't sit well with certain people. Samuel nodded. I'm not here to make friends, Captain Harper. I'm here to fix this department. If that means ruffling a few feathers, so be it. Harper studied him for a moment before giving a curt nod. Understood. If you need anything, let me know. As she left the room, Samuel took a moment to collect his thoughts. He had read every file, every complaint, and every internal report about this department before taking the job. The toxicity ran deep, and it wasn't going to be an easy fight. But Samuel had faced adversity his entire life, and he wasn't about to back down now. Samuel spent the rest of the day walking through the precinct, making his presence known. He stopped by the detective division, observing their case boards and chatting briefly with a few officers. He noted the guarded looks and curt responses. Some were polite but distant, while others avoided eye contact altogether. In the patrol division, he introduced himself to a few younger officers. One of them, Officer Elena Reyes, stood out. She was fresh-faced, her uniform crisp, and her eyes sharp with curiosity. When Samuel approached her, she looked surprised but quickly composed herself. "Chief Bryant," she said, extending a hand. Samuel shook it firmly. "Officer Reyes, how long have you been with the department?" "Just under a year, sir," she replied. "I graduated from the academy last spring." He nodded. "Good to meet you. How are you finding the job so far?" Reyes hesitated, glancing around before answering. "It's been a learning experience, sir." Samuel noticed the slight hesitation in her voice. "I appreciate honesty, Officer Reyes. If there's ever something on your mind, my door is always open." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you, Chief. I'll keep that in mind." As he moved on, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that Reyes had more to say. He made a mental note to follow up with her later. The real work began the next morning. Samuel called a meeting with Captain Harper and several department heads to outline his plans for the precinct's transformation. The room was a mix of skepticism and cautious optimism. Samuel started by addressing the elephant in the room. "I'm aware that some of you think my actions yesterday were drastic. Let me assure you, they were necessary. This department has a reputation, a bad one. And it's not just the community that knows it. I've read the complaints, the lawsuits, and the disciplinary records. Change is not optional. It's overdue." One of the older officers, Lieutenant Grayson, leaned back in his chair, his expression skeptical. "Chief, with all due respect, this department has been run a certain way for years. You can't expect to flip a switch and make it something it's not." Samuel met his gaze with unwavering resolve. "Lieutenant Grayson, I understand that change doesn't happen overnight, but let me be clear. I'm not here to preserve the status quo. I'm here to build a department that this community can trust, and that starts with accountability." Grayson shifted uncomfortably, but didn't argue further. Captain Harper, to her credit, backed Samuel up. "The chief's right," she said. "We've been coasting for too long. It's time to face the music." Samuel laid out his plans methodically. There would be mandatory training on cultural sensitivity, de-escalation tactics, and implicit bias. Complaints of misconduct would no longer be swept under the rug. Every report would be thoroughly investigated. He also proposed regular community outreach programs to rebuild trust with the public. By the end of the meeting, the room was quiet, the weight of Samuel's vision sinking in. Some nodded in agreement, while others remained stoic, their expressions unreadable. That afternoon, Samuel received his first challenge. Daniels, despite his suspension, had shown up at the precinct, demanding a meeting. Samuel agreed, knowing it was an opportunity to make his stance clear. Daniels entered Samuel's office with a cocky swagger, his uniform still pressed as if he hadn't been suspended. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "Chief, we need to talk about this suspension. It's unnecessary and completely unfair." Samuel leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but firm. "Sit down, Officer Daniels." Daniels hesitated before complying. "Look, I don't know what you think you saw yesterday, but I saw exactly what I needed to see, Samuel interrupted. And it wasn't just about you spitting in my face, Daniels. It was about the culture you've helped perpetuate in this department. Daniel's face reddened. I've been here for years. I know how things work. You can't just come in and throw everything out the window. Samuel leaned forward, his voice low and steady. You're right, Daniels. I can't change everything overnight. But I can start with you. Your behavior was unacceptable, and it's not the first time you've crossed the line. The difference now is that there are consequences. Daniels opened his mouth to argue, but Samuel held up a hand. Save it. Your suspension stands, and if the investigation finds further misconduct, I won't hesitate to recommend your termination. Daniels glared at him, his jaw tightening. This isn't over. No, it's not, Samuel said evenly. But you better believe I'll see it through. Daniels stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Samuel exhaled slowly, the tension in the room dissipating. He knew this was just the first of many battles he would face. By the end of the week, the precinct was a different place. Samuel's presence was felt in every corner, his commitment to change impossible to ignore. Officers who had once turned a blind eye to misconduct now hesitated, unsure of how far Samuel's reach extended. Samuel knew it was only the beginning. Change would be slow, and resistance was inevitable. But as he walked through the precinct that evening, greeting officers and observing their interactions, he saw something he hadn't expected, small signs of progress. It was in the way Officer Reyes spoke up during a team briefing, suggesting a more inclusive approach to community engagement. It was in the way some of the older officers adjusted their tone when addressing younger recruits. It was in the way the precinct, once a bastion of unchecked power, began to crack under the weight of Samuel's resolve. He knew there was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, he felt hope. One step at a time, Samuel Bryant would transform Maplewood, and he wouldn't stop until the job was done. Seeds of resistance and growth. The Maplewood Police Department buzzed with an unfamiliar energy in the days following Samuel Bryant's bold debut. The usual hum of camaraderie among the officers had dulled, replaced by murmurs of discontent and whispered speculation. While some quietly respected the new chief's decisive actions, others bristled at the changes he promised. Samuel was not blind to this tension. He expected it, even welcomed it. It meant people were paying attention. Samuel's day began early. He arrived at the precinct before sunrise, walking the quiet halls and reviewing case files in his modest office. He refused the larger, more ostentatious office offered to him, opting instead for a space closer to his team, where he could hear the daily rhythm of the department. This morning, he focused on complaints and internal reports, identifying patterns in misconduct and lapses in procedure. As he sifted through the documents, a knock at the door broke his concentration. Captain Judith Harper stepped in, carrying a cup of steaming coffee. Her expression was cautious but intrigued. "Morning, Chief," she said, setting the cup on his desk. "Thought you might need this." Samuel offered a small smile. "Thanks, Judith. What's on your mind?" She crossed her arms and leaned against the doorframe. "Word is spreading fast about Daniels. Some of the officers are questioning whether you've got a personal vendetta against him." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "Do they?" "More like they're afraid you're coming for them next," she admitted. "Not everyone's happy about the changes you're pushing." Samuel leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in his lap. "That's to be expected. Change isn't comfortable, especially for those who've benefited from the way things were." Judith nodded thoughtfully. "I've been here long enough to know which way the wind blows, Chief. And right now, it's blowing against you. But I've also seen departments turn around under strong leadership. If anyone can pull it off, it's you." Samuel appreciated her candor. "Thanks, Judith. I'll need your support more than ever in the coming weeks. There's a lot of work to do." Judith straightened, her expression resolute. "You've got it, Chief. Let me know how I can help." As she left, Samuel turned back to the files. He made a note to convene a meeting later that week to address the brewing concerns among the staff. Later that morning, Samuel decided to visit the patrol division's morning briefing. He arrived unannounced, standing quietly in the back as officers prepared for their shifts. The room was filled with a mix of seasoned veterans and younger recruits, their chatter stopping abruptly when they noticed the chief's presence. Lieutenant Grayson, who led the briefing, cleared his throat awkwardly. "Chief Bryant, we weren't expecting you." Samuel stepped forward, his hands clasped behind his back. "I thought I'd sit in today." "Don't let me interrupt." Grayson nodded stiffly and resumed the briefing, outlining assignments and discussing ongoing cases. Samuel listened intently, noting the dynamics between the officers. Some worked seamlessly as a team, while others seemed disconnected, their interactions laced with tension. When the briefing ended, Samuel addressed the room. "Good morning, everyone. I wanted to take a moment to thank you for your hard work and dedication. I know the past few days have been a bit of a shake-up, but I want to be clear. I'm not here to make your jobs harder. I'm here to make this department stronger." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I know change can be uncomfortable, but it's necessary. We have a responsibility to each other and to the community we serve. That means holding ourselves to the highest standards. I'm not asking for perfection, but I am asking for accountability. My door is always open if you have questions or concerns." The room was silent as the officers absorbed his message. Some nodded subtly, while others remained stoic. Samuel knew he couldn't win everyone over immediately, but he hoped to plant the seeds of trust. As the day went on, Samuel noticed subtle shifts in behavior. Officers who once avoided eye contact now offered hesitant nods. A few even approached him to introduce themselves. Among them was Officer Elena Reyes, the young recruit who had caught his attention earlier. "Chief Bryant," she said, stopping him in the hallway. "Do you have a moment?" Samuel gestured for her to walk with him. "What's on your mind, Officer Reyes?" She hesitated before speaking, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "I just wanted to say, I appreciate what you're trying to do here. I've seen things in this department that don't sit right with me, but I didn't know how to speak up before." Samuel gave her a reassuring smile. "It takes courage to speak up, Reyes. That's the first step toward making a difference. If you ever see something that needs addressing, don't hesitate to come to me." Reyes nodded, her expression determined. "Thank you, Chief. I won't let you down." Not everyone shared Reyes' attitude, however. In the locker room that afternoon, a group of officers gathered, their conversation tinged with resentment. "Who does he think he is, coming in here like he's better than us?" one officer muttered, slamming his locker shut. "He's just another bureaucrat trying to make a name for himself," another replied. "Bet he won't last 6 months." Daniels, who had ignored his suspension and returned to the precinct under the pretense of gathering personal belongings, joined the conversation. His face was a mask of defiance. "Bryant doesn't understand how things work here. He's all talk. You'll see. Guys like him don't stick around." The officers exchanged uneasy glances. While some nodded in agreement, others seemed less certain. The cracks in their unity were beginning to show. As the week progressed, Samuel focused on building bridges with the community. He organized a town hall meeting, inviting residents to share their concerns and suggestions. The turnout was larger than expected, with dozens of people filling the local community center. Samuel stood at the front of the room, listening intently as residents voiced their frustrations. Many spoke of feeling ignored or mistreated by the police. Others shared stories of officers who had gone above and beyond to help. The divide between the department and the community was evident, but so was the potential for healing. When it was his turn to speak, Samuel addressed the crowd with sincerity. "I won't pretend that I can fix everything overnight, but I promise you this: I will listen, I will act, and I will hold this department accountable. We're here to serve you, not the other way around." His words were met with cautious applause. It was a small step, but Samuel knew it was a step in the right direction. Back at the precinct, Samuel found Captain Harper waiting for him in his office. She held a thick folder, her expression serious. "What's this?" Samuel asked as she placed the folder on his desk. "Daniel's personnel file," she replied. "It's worse than we thought. Multiple complaints, most of them swept under the rug by his former supervisors." Samuel opened the folder, his jaw tightening as he read. Excessive force, racially insensitive comments, intimidation tactics. The pattern was clear. "This stops now," Samuel said firmly. "Prepare a full report. We're taking this to the board." Harper nodded. "Understood, Chief." As the door closed behind her, Samuel leaned back in his chair, the weight of the task ahead pressing on him. He knew the road would be long and fraught with challenges, but he also knew he couldn't back down. Change was never easy, but it was always worth it. That evening, as Samuel walked through the quiet precinct, he noticed Officer Rice at her desk, working late. She looked up and offered a small smile. "Burning the midnight oil?" Samuel asked, stopping by her desk. Rice shrugged. "Just trying to stay ahead. There's a lot to learn." Samuel nodded. "Keep at it, Rice. You're exactly what this department needs." As he walked away, he felt a glimmer of hope. Change was coming to Maplewood, and while resistance remained, so did the promise of a brighter future. One step at a time, Samuel would lead his team toward that vision, no matter the cost. The pressure mounts. The chill of the early morning air seeped into the walls of the Maplewood Police Department. Samuel Bryant sat in his office, the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the muffled bustle of the precinct filtering through the closed door. A steaming mug of black coffee sat untouched on his desk as he stared at the personnel file of Officer Mark Daniels. The list of complaints and transgressions was staggering, each page another testament to the systemic failures that had allowed such behavior to flourish unchecked. Samuel rubbed his temples. The weight of his mission loomed larger than ever. Daniel's suspension was just the beginning, but it had already sent ripples through the department. Some officers supported the change, others resisted it, and a few had made their hostility unmistakably clear. Outside the chief's office, the mood in the precinct had grown more tense. Conversations were subdued, and the usual banter between officers had given way to cautious whispers. Everyone was on edge, wondering who might be next to face Samuel's scrutiny. Officer Elena Rice felt the shift keenly. She had always been cautious about voicing her concerns, but under Samuel's leadership, she saw a glimmer of hope. Still, her decision to step forward and support the chief hadn't gone unnoticed. As she stood at the coffee machine that morning, she overheard two senior officers, O'Malley and Jensen, talking in hushed tones nearby. "Rice is getting a little too cozy with the new chief," O'Malley muttered. "Does she think throwing the rest of us under the bus will save her?" Jensen snorted. "She's just trying to climb the ladder." "Let her. Bryant won't last long." "They never do." Rice stiffened but kept her back to them, pretending not to hear. Their words stung, but she reminded herself why she had chosen this path. Change wasn't about popularity. It was about doing what was right. Meanwhile, Samuel called a meeting with Captain Judith Harper and Internal Affairs Officer Diane Wexler. Wexler was a sharp, no-nonsense investigator who had a reputation for integrity, a rare trait in a department where loyalty often outweighed ethics. "Thank you for coming," Samuel began, gesturing for them to sit. "I've been reviewing Daniel's file, and it's clear we're dealing with more than just an isolated issue. The lack of accountability in this department runs deep." Wexler nodded, her expression grim. "I've been aware of some of the problems, but I didn't have the authority to act. Now, with your backing, we can start digging." Samuel leaned forward, his voice firm. "I want a full audit of misconduct cases from the past 5 years. Every complaint, every incident swept under the rug. I want it all. We're not just cleaning house, we're rebuilding the foundation." Harper glanced at Wexler. "This is going to ruffle a lot of feathers, Chief. Some officers might push back hard." Samuel met her gaze. "Let them. If they're more concerned about protecting their egos than doing their jobs, they don't belong here. Wexler's eyes gleamed with determination. Consider it done, Chief. As the day progressed, word of the audit began to spread. Officers exchanged uneasy glances, and the tension in the precinct grew thicker. Samuel knew the backlash was inevitable, but he hadn't anticipated the extent of the resistance. By mid-afternoon, a small group of officers, led by none other than Daniels, who had not taken kindly to his suspension, gathered outside the precinct, openly protesting. They claimed Samuel's leadership was heavy-handed and unfair, accusing him of targeting long-serving officers without cause. Samuel watched the scene unfold from his office window. Daniels stood at the center of the group, his arms crossed and his face a mask of defiance. A few officers held hastily made signs, while others simply loitered, their presence a silent act of rebellion. Captain Harper entered Samuel's office, her expression a mixture of concern and frustration. "They're trying to undermine you, Chief. This could get messy." Samuel's jaw tightened. Let them protest. They're only proving why this department needs change. Harper hesitated. What if it escalates? The media could get involved. Samuel turned to her, his eyes steely. Then we'll show the media exactly why we're making these changes. I'm not here to appease a corrupt system. I'm here to fix it. Later that evening, Samuel held a town hall meeting at the community center. The room was packed, the energy palpable. Residents filled every seat, some standing against the walls, eager to voice their concerns. Samuel stood at the front, his hands resting on the podium. "Good evening. Thank you all for coming. I'm Chief Samuel Bryant, and I'm here to listen." For the next hour, the residents didn't hold back. They shared stories of mistrust, profiling, and abuse at the hands of officers. Samuel took notes, his expression somber but resolute. He didn't interrupt or make excuses. He simply listened. An elderly man stood up, his voice shaky but firm. "I've lived in this town my whole life. I've seen good officers and bad ones. What makes you different, Chief? Why should we trust you?" Samuel met the man's gaze. "Because I don't just talk about change, I act on it. I've already started making changes within the department, and I promise you, I won't stop until this community can trust its police force again." The room erupted in applause, though some clapped more hesitantly than others. Samuel knew trust wouldn't come easily, but the support of even a few residents was a step in the right direction. Back at the precinct, the protest had fizzled out by nightfall. Daniels and his group had dispersed, but their defiance lingered like a shadow over the department. Samuel returned to his office, exhausted but undeterred. He found a stack of papers waiting on his desk, a preliminary report from Wexler detailing past misconduct cases. He skimmed the pages, his frustration mounting with each incident. Excessive force, discriminatory behavior, and outright negligence were all documented but buried under layers of bureaucracy. Samuel's resolve hardened. This wasn't just about Daniels. It was about dismantling a culture that had been allowed to thrive for far too long. As he closed the folder, a knock at the door drew his attention. Officer Rice stood in the doorway, looking nervous but determined. "Chief, do you have a moment?" Samuel gestured for her to enter. "Of course, Officer Rice. What's on your mind?" She hesitated, then stepped forward. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about accountability. I want to help. I've seen things, heard things. I know some officers are pushing back against you, but I believe in what you're doing." Samuel studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I appreciate that, Reyes. It takes courage to stand up, especially in the face of resistance." Reyes nodded, her jaw set. "I'll do whatever it takes, Chief. This department needs to change, and I want to be part of that change." Samuel smiled, a genuine warmth in his expression. "You already are, Reyes. Keep doing what you're doing, and don't let anyone intimidate you. We're in this together." As Reyes left, Samuel leaned back in his chair, the weight of the day pressing down on him. He knew the road ahead would only get tougher, but he also knew he wasn't alone. Little by little, he was building a team of allies, both within the department and in the community. Together, they would forge a new path, one step at a time. Cracks in the armor. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Maplewood Police Department as Samuel Bryant arrived early. He stood outside for a moment, taking in the quiet before the storm. The events of the past week had escalated tensions both within the precinct and in the community. The growing divide between those resisting change and those embracing it was tangible, but Samuel remained steadfast. He hadn't uprooted his life and career to falter now. Inside, the precinct hummed with activity. Officers moved with purpose, their usual banter muted by the ever-present tension. Samuel walked through the main corridor, his presence commanding attention. A few officers nodded in greeting, while others avoided his gaze entirely. He noticed the shift but didn't let it deter him. As he entered his office, Captain Judith Harper was already waiting for him, a thick folder in hand. Her expression was grim. "Morning, Chief," she said, placing the folder on his desk. "You need to see this." Samuel opened the folder and scanned the contents. It was a summary of the misconduct audit spearheaded by Internal Affairs Officer Diane Wexler. The findings were damning. Years of unchecked behavior, ignored complaints, and a culture that rewarded silence over accountability. "This is worse than I imagined," Samuel said, his voice low but resolute. "How did this go on for so long?" Harper sighed, leaning against the desk. "It's like you said, Chief, culture. When the leadership looks the other way, the rot spreads. Daniels and his crew aren't the only problem. They're just the most visible." Samuel closed the folder and met her gaze. "Then we root it out. All of it. I need a plan to address these findings and implement changes immediately." Harper hesitated. "Chief, this is going to rattle some cages. If you thought Daniels was a problem, wait until you see how the rest of them react." Samuel leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but firm. "Let them rattle. If we don't face this head-on, we're complicit. I won't let that happen." By mid-morning, the precinct was abuzz with whispers about the audit. Word had spread quickly, and the officers were on edge. Samuel called a meeting with his leadership team, including Wexler and Harper, to outline the next steps. The room was filled with tense faces as Samuel stood at the head of the table. He began by addressing the elephant in the room. "I know many of you are aware of the audit findings," he said, his voice steady. "Let me be clear. This is not about punishing individuals for the sake of appearances. This is about restoring integrity to this department." He paused, letting his words sink in. "The community we serve deserves better, and so do the good officers who come to work every day with honor and dedication. From this point forward, there will be zero tolerance for misconduct. Every complaint will be investigated thoroughly, and every officer will be held accountable." Lieutenant Grayson, who had remained skeptical of Samuel's leadership, leaned forward. "Chief, I understand the need for reform, but do you really think sweeping changes like this can happen overnight? You're asking us to rewrite the culture of this department. That's not something you can dictate." Samuel met his gaze, his tone unwavering. "I'm not asking for perfection, Lieutenant. I'm asking for progress. Change won't happen overnight, but it won't happen at all if we keep making excuses for the status quo." Grayson sat back, his expression thoughtful but guarded. The rest of the room remained quiet, their faces a mix of apprehension and resolve. Outside the meeting, tensions continued to simmer. Officer Elena Reyes found herself caught in the crossfire. Her support for the chief's initiatives had made her a target among some of the more resistant officers. As she worked on a report at her desk, she overheard a heated conversation nearby. "You see Reyes? She's practically Bryant's shadow," one officer muttered. "Bet she's feeding him everything he wants to hear." "Yeah, trying to get ahead by throwing the rest of us under the bus," another added. Reyes clenched her fists but didn't respond. She had expected pushback, but it still stung. Later, as she prepared to head out on patrol, Samuel stopped her in the hallway. "Officer Reyes," he said, his voice calm but direct. "Do you have a moment?" She nodded, following him into his office. Once inside, he gestured for her to sit. "I've noticed you've been stepping up lately," Samuel said. "But I've also noticed some of your colleagues aren't taking kindly to it." Reyes hesitated before speaking. "It's nothing I can't handle, Chief. I believe in what you're doing. That's all that matters." Samuel studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I appreciate your dedication, Reyes, but remember, you're not alone in this. If you ever feel like the pressure is too much, come to me." She nodded, her resolve strengthening. "Thank you, Chief. I won't back down." That afternoon, the storm brewing within the department finally came to a head. A group of officers, led by Daniels, filed a formal grievance against Samuel, accusing him of overreach and unfair targeting of certain individuals. The grievance was an obvious attempt to undermine his authority, but it carried weight nonetheless. Samuel met with Wexler and Harper to discuss the situation. "This isn't surprising," Wexler said, flipping through the grievance document. "Daniels is trying to rally support and paint himself as the victim." Harper frowned. "He's playing dirty, Chief. If this gets traction, it could slow down everything we're trying to accomplish." Samuel's expression hardened. "Let them come at me. I won't back down. If anything, this proves how deeply rooted the problems in this department are. We stay the course." The following day, Samuel addressed the entire department in a rare all-hands meeting. The officers gathered in the precinct's main briefing room, the atmosphere heavy with anticipation. Samuel stood at the front, his posture commanding yet approachable. He began by acknowledging the challenges ahead. "I know these past few weeks have been difficult," he said. "Change is never easy, especially when it challenges long-standing norms. But let me remind you why we're here: to serve and protect this community with honor, integrity, and respect." He scanned the room, his gaze steady. "I've heard the whispers, the doubts, and the grievances. I understand that some of you feel targeted or unfairly treated, but this isn't about singling anyone out. This is about rebuilding trust within this department and with the community we serve." The room was silent as Samuel continued. "If you're willing to embrace that mission, you have my full support. But if you're not, this may not be the place for you." His words hung in the air, the challenge clear. Some officers looked down, others exchanged uneasy glances, but a few, like Reyes, sat a little taller, their resolve unshaken. That evening, as Samuel reviewed the day's events in his office, Harper stopped by with a rare smile. "You've stirred up quite the hornet's nest, Chief," she said, leaning against the doorframe. "But I think you're starting to get through to them." Samuel allowed himself a small smile. "One step at a time, Judith. We'll get there." As she left, Samuel leaned back in his chair, the weight of the day settling over him. The battle for change was far from over, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't fighting it alone. Little by little, the cracks in the old armor of resistance were growing, making way for something stronger and more just. A new foundation. The cold rain tapped steadily against the windows of the Maplewood Police Department as Samuel Bryant sat in his office. It had been a long, grueling month since he had taken the reins of the department, and the challenges had come at him from all sides. From Daniel's blatant insubordination to the quiet resistance among senior officers, Samuel had faced every test with unwavering resolve. Yet, as he reviewed the final reports from the department-wide audit, a glimmer of hope began to shine through. The precinct was quieter than usual that morning. The storm outside mirrored the subdued atmosphere inside. Officer Elena Reyes, now regarded as one of Samuel's most trusted supporters, noticed the shift. The whispers and sneers had lessened, replaced by cautious respect, or, at the very least, resigned acceptance. She walked into the squad room with her head held high, ready to tackle the day. Reyes wasn't the only one who had changed. Officers who had once ignored Samuel's presence now greeted him with nods or brief salutations, It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a start. Samuel's reforms were beginning to take hold. The training programs he implemented had sparked uncomfortable but necessary conversations about bias and accountability. Community outreach events were slowly rebuilding trust, with more residents attending each week. But perhaps most importantly, the officers who truly cared about their roles were beginning to step forward, shedding the toxic culture that had stifled them. That afternoon, Samuel called another all-hands meeting, this time in a larger space to accommodate members of the community. The room was filled with officers, city officials, and residents. The tension was palpable, but Samuel's presence at the podium commanded attention. He began by addressing the results of the audit. The findings were not easy to read, he admitted, his voice steady. They revealed a department that had lost its way, but they also revealed something else, an opportunity for change. He looked out over the crowd, his gaze unwavering. We've made progress. Complaints that were once ignored are now being addressed. Officers are receiving training to help them serve with empathy and professionalism. And our community, despite everything, is giving us a chance to rebuild their trust. A murmur rippled through the room. Samuel raised a hand to silence it. But we're not done. Change is not a destination. It's a journey. And we cannot succeed without your support, both within this department and in this community. He paused, his eyes scanning the audience. To those of you who have embraced this mission, I thank you. To those of you still on the fence, I urge you to consider why you wear that badge. And to those who actively resist, I offer you this choice. Commit to the standards we uphold, or find another path. The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Samuel let the moment linger before concluding. Together, we can create a department we're proud of, one that serves this community with honor, integrity, and respect. As he stepped down from the podium, the applause started slowly but grew steadily. Some clapped hesitantly, others wholeheartedly. But the message was clear. Samuel's vision was taking root. That evening, as the precinct buzzed with a cautious sense of optimism, Samuel sat in his office with Captain Judith Harper and Internal Affairs Officer Diane Wexler. They reviewed the latest developments, including Daniel's formal termination after the audit confirmed years of unchecked misconduct. Harper leaned back in her chair, a rare smile on her face. You did it, Chief. Daniels is out, and the department's starting to turn around. Wexler nodded in agreement. There's still work to do, but we're seeing real progress. Officers are stepping up, and the community is beginning to trust us again. Samuel allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, but quickly refocused. This is just the beginning. We've set the foundation, but it's up to all of us to build on it. Harper raised an eyebrow. Ever think about slowing down, Chief? You've already done more in a month than most chiefs do in a year. Samuel chuckled softly. Change doesn't wait, Judith. Neither can we. Later that night, Samuel attended a community meeting at the local youth center. The room was filled with families, local leaders, and young people who had grown up distrusting the police. Samuel listened as residents shared their concerns and hopes, taking notes and responding thoughtfully. One young boy, no older than 10, approached Samuel hesitantly after the meeting. "Are you really the chief?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Samuel knelt to meet the boy's gaze. "I am. What's your name?" "Marcus," the boy replied, clutching a worn baseball cap. "My mom says the police don't care about people like us." Samuel's chest tightened, but he maintained a warm smile. "I can't change the past, Marcus. But I promise you, we're working to do better. And if you ever need help, you come find me, okay?" Marcus nodded, a small smile breaking across his face. It was moments like this that reminded Samuel why he had taken this job in the first place. As Samuel drove back to the precinct, he reflected on the journey so far. The resistance, the hostility, the small but meaningful victories, all of it had brought him to this moment. He knew the road ahead would still be challenging, but he also knew he wasn't walking it alone. When he arrived at the precinct, he found Officer Rice waiting for him outside his office. She looked tired but determined. "Chief, I just wanted to say thank you," she said, "for believing in this department, for believing in us." Samuel smiled. "Thank you, Rice. You've been a big part of this change. Keep pushing forward." As she left, Samuel sat down at his desk, his heart full but his resolve unshaken. The foundation had been laid, but the real work was just beginning. With a renewed sense of purpose, he picked up his pen and began drafting the next phase of reforms. By the end of his first year, the Maplewood Police Department was unrecognizable from the toxic environment Samuel had inherited. Trust was slowly being rebuilt, both within the department and in the community it served. Samuel knew there was still much to do, but for the first time, he felt confident that the department was on the right path. Change wasn't easy, but it was always worth it. And Samuel Bryant was just getting started.